Story 1. I remember that night like it was yesterday. I was standing watch as the officer of the deck during RIMPAC, far from the shores of any comfort. If you've never been on the bridge of a ship during a night steam, let me paint it for you. Darkness so deep you could drown in it, pierced only by the dim glow of navigational instruments and the occasional glimmer of bioluminescence in the water below. Our section had been assigned a steam box, an empty grid of the Pacific where we'd zigzag to stay clear of other participants. Routine and monotonous. That's what everyone called it. I tried to stay sharp, but hours into my watch, the silence and the steady hum of the engines began to weigh on me. My bridge team was alert but quiet, as if the night had sucked the energy from all of us. I kept my eyes forward, scanning the horizon through the glass. That's when I saw it. At first I thought it was a star, a bright point of light just above the horizon, but then it moved, fast, not like any aircraft or satellite I'd ever seen. It darted left, then right, stopping abruptly before streaking upward at an impossible angle. My heart froze. "Hey, you see that?" I asked my boatswain's mate of the watch, leaning closer to the window. "See what, sir?" he replied, his tone half interested as he turned to look. "Right there," I said, pointing. "Above the horizon. That light, it's moving." He squinted, then froze. "What the hell is that?" I grabbed the binoculars from the console and focused on it. The light wasn't just moving, it was dancing. It moved in sharp, jagged patterns, zigzagging and looping in ways no plane or drone could manage. There was no sound, no contrail, no indication of propulsion. It was just there. "Radar, report!" I barked, trying to keep my voice steady. The Combat Information Center should have had eyes on anything within miles of us. "Bridge, this is Combat," came the reply over the sound-powered phones. "Nothing on radar. Clear skies." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "Nothing at all?" "Negative, sir." I turned to the lookout on the port side. "Lookout, confirm visual contact with a light above the horizon, bearing 090. The lookout hesitated, then spoke, his voice tight. "Aye, sir, I see it, but I don't know what it is." I glanced back at the boatswain's mate. "Bring the team up here. I want everyone's eyes on this." Within minutes, the entire bridge team was glued to the windows or peering through binoculars. Everyone was whispering, exchanging nervous glances. "Sir, it's not moving like anything I've ever seen," one of the junior officers said, his voice trembling. "No aircraft can do that," another whispered. I tried to stay calm, to think logically. "Maybe it's some kind of new tech," I said, though I didn't believe it. "Not out here, in the middle of nowhere. Not with no RADAR signature." And then it got worse. The lights split. One became 2, then 3, then 4, each moving in perfect synchronization. They formed a tight triangle, then spiraled outward in a way that made my stomach turn. "Sir?" the boatswain's mate whispered, his voice barely audible. This ain't normal." "No kidding," I muttered, unable to take my eyes off the lights. For a moment they hovered, perfectly still. The sea around us was calm, the engines thrumming beneath our feet the only sound. Then without warning, the lights converged into a single, brilliant flash. The bridge was bathed in blinding white light for less than a second, and then it was gone. The horizon was empty. No lights, no movement, just the endless expanse of dark ocean. "Combat, bridge," I said, my voice unsteady. "Confirm no contacts in our vicinity." "Bridge, combat," came the reply. "Negative contacts. Area is clear." I turned to my team, my heart pounding. Did everyone see that?" One by one, they nodded. No one spoke. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the hum of the ship and the faint crackle of the radio. "We're logging this," I said finally. "I want every single person here to sign off on the deck log. We all saw it. We're documenting it." The boatswain's mate grabbed the logbook, and I dictated the contact report. An unidentified flying object, visual only, no radar contact, no hostile action. Everyone signed it, their faces pale. For the rest of the watch, no one spoke unless absolutely necessary. Every shadow, every flicker of light on the water made my skin crawl. When my relief came, I handed over the log and briefed him on what had happened. He stared at me like I was crazy, but I didn't care. I lay in my rack that night, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events over and over. The way the lights moved, the flash, the silence afterward. It didn't add up. It wasn't just strange. It was impossible. And the worst part? Deep down, I knew we weren't alone out there. Not that night. Maybe not ever. Story 2. I was stationed at Mare Island Naval Station in Vallejo, California in 1984. Back then, the base was still alive with activity, though its glory days were long past. A few of the buildings, remnants of World War I, stood as eerie monuments to their history. Some whispered they were haunted, particularly the old hospital buildings, H1, H78, and H79. Most of us shrugged it off as sailor folklore, stories told to pass the time. But the night I pulled watch at H78/79, those whispers became something else. It was a cold, damp night, the kind where the fog rolls in off the water and clings to your skin. My watch was from midnight to 2 a.m., and I was stationed at the main entrance of H78. The building was dark, locked, and completely empty. My job was simple: stay alert and make rounds to ensure everything was secure. I remember stepping inside and feeling an immediate shift in the air. It was heavy, almost oppressive. The dim emergency lighting cast long shadows down the hallways, and the silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional hum of the old elevator by the main desk. I made my first round, flashlight in hand, walking the length of the first floor before taking the stairs to the upper levels. The stairs creaked under my boots as I ascended, each step echoing in the emptiness. By the time I reached the 4th floor, the air felt even heavier. I opened a door to what I assumed was just another office space, but found an old surgical suite instead. The room was frozen in time. Metal tables, rusting instruments, and overhead lights hung like relics of a forgotten era. My breath hitched as my flashlight beam swept over an old gurney in the corner. For a moment, I thought I saw something, a shadow moving across the room. I froze, my heart pounding. But the beam revealed nothing but dust and peeling paint. I chalked it up to nerves and moved on. On my way back down, I passed the instructor's lounge on the 2nd floor. Through the frosted glass door, I saw the flickering light of a television. I opened the door to find the small black and white set on, static hissing from the speakers. It startled me. The building was supposed to be empty, and these old TVs didn't have remotes. You had to physically pull the knob to turn them on. I stepped inside, reached out, and pushed the knob in. The static cut off, plunging the room into silence. I shook my head, muttering to myself about faulty wiring, and returned to my post by the main entrance. That's when the elevator started acting up. It shuddered to life, groaning as it ascended to the 2nd floor. Then after a moment, it came back down. The doors opened with a mechanical ding, revealing an empty car. I stared at it, my pulse quickening. There was no one else in the building. I was sure of that. Still, I convinced myself it was just a glitch. It was an old building after all. I tried to focus on the quiet, the ticking of my watch, the distant foghorns from the bay. But then the elevator did it again, this time going all the way to the 4th floor before returning to the 1st. Again, the doors opened to an empty car. I considered calling it in, but decided against it. I didn't want to be the guy who panicked over a faulty elevator. I forced myself to sit still, to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. At 1 a.m., I made another round. I hesitated as I passed the instructor's lounge, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened the door. The TV was on again, the same static hissing from the screen. My stomach dropped. I stepped inside, every muscle in my body tense. The knob was pulled out, just as it had been earlier. My hands shook as I pushed it back in, silencing the TV for the 2nd time. I stood there for a moment, listening to the oppressive quiet, half expecting something, anything to happen. When I stepped back into the hallway, the elevator dinged. The door slid open, and this time, the air that spilled out was ice cold. I stood there, staring at the empty car, my heart hammering in my chest. Something felt wrong. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to leave, but I couldn't. Not yet. I forced myself to finish my rounds, though I didn't dare go back to the 4th floor. By the time I returned to my post, the building felt different. The silence wasn't just quiet anymore. It was suffocating. Even the elevator had gone still, as if waiting. I didn't make another round that night. I stayed by the main entrance, my eyes fixed on the hallway, my ears straining for any sound. The minutes dragged by, each one feeling like an eternity. When my relief finally arrived, I practically ran out of the building. I didn't mention the TV, the elevator, or the cold air. Who would have believed me? But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in there, that someone, had been watching me the entire time. To this day, I don't know what I experienced in H78. Maybe it was just an overactive imagination, fueled by stories of ghosts in old hospitals, or maybe it wasn't. All I know is I've never felt fear like that since, and I never set foot in that building again. Story 3. I served as an officer on a merchant vessel a few years ago, a job that took me to the darkest, loneliest corners of the ocean. Nights at sea were always quiet and vast, an oppressive kind of silence that could swallow you whole if you let it, the kind of silence that felt alive. This particular night, I was the officer of the deck, OOD, my usual midnight watch. We were in the Philippine Sea, a stretch of water notorious for its wartime history. It was one of those moonless nights, the kind where the horizon melted into the sky and the sea felt like an abyss. Only the hum of the ship's engines and the occasional crackle of the radio broke the silence. The crew was asleep, save for the lookout on the bridge wing and myself. I remember the air felt thick, like something unseen was pressing down on us. It was well past 300 when the lookout, a young seaman named Harris, burst into the bridge, his face pale as death. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there wide-eyed, clutching the doorframe. "Harris, what's wrong?" I asked, startled by his abrupt entrance. I heard something, sir," he stammered, his voice shaking. "A man, crying for help." I froze. "Where?" "Port side," he whispered. It sounded close, like someone was right there in the water. I stepped out onto the bridge wing, the cold night air biting against my skin. "Where exactly?" I asked, scanning the inky darkness. Harris pointed into the void. "There, sir. Just there." The ocean was still, no sign of life beyond the gentle swells illuminated by the ship's lights. I strained my ears, but all I heard was the steady thrum of the engines and the distant creak of the hull. For a moment, I thought Harris might have imagined it. Nights at sea could play tricks on your mind. Then I heard it, faint, almost drowned out by the wind. A voice, a man's voice. "Help me!" It was barely audible, but it was there. My blood ran cold. I grabbed the binoculars and scanned the waters, but there was nothing. No life jackets, no debris, no movement, just endless black waves. "Sound the general alarm," I ordered, my voice tighter than I'd have liked. Harris hesitated for a moment before sprinting to comply. The alarm shattered the eerie silence, and within minutes the crew began mustering on deck. I grabbed the mic and called for a full muster, my hands trembling slightly. The muster report came back clear. Everyone was accounted for. Every single soul on board was present. Could it be a distress call from another vessel? One of the senior officers suggested. I shook my head. There's no sign of any shipwreck or wreckage nearby, and no vessels have been reported in the area. "But we all heard it," Harris insisted, looking around as if begging for someone to validate his experience. I swear I wasn't imagining it. The captain joined us on the bridge, his face grim as he reviewed the reports. "Where exactly are we right now?" he asked me. I pointed to our location on the chart. The captain's expression darkened, his jaw tightening. This is near where the USS Indianapolis went down," he muttered under his breath. A chill shot through me. I knew the story, how the ship had been torpedoed in the final days of World War II, how hundreds of sailors had been left floating in the water for days, picked off one by sharks, dehydration, and madness. It was one of the greatest tragedies in naval history. The captain didn't elaborate further, but I could see the unease in his eyes. "Maintain course and speed," he ordered. "We'll log the incident and move on." We resumed our watch, but the atmosphere on the bridge was heavy. Harris refused to go back out to the bridge wing alone, and I couldn't blame him. The rest of the watch passed in uneasy silence, each of us straining to hear the voice again. But it didn't return. The next morning, the ordinary seaman assigned to maintenance duty came to me with something that made my stomach lurch. "Sir," one of them said, holding up a soaked scrap of fabric, "we found this tangled in the starboard anchor chain." I took the fabric, my heart pounding as I examined it. It was faded, discolored by salt water, but unmistakable. It was a piece of a U.S. Navy uniform, the kind issued during World War II. The edges were frayed and torn, as though it had been adrift for decades. We brought it to the captain, who stared at it for a long moment before locking it in his office. "We don't speak of this," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Not to the crew, not to anyone. But word spread anyway, as it always does on a ship. The sailors whispered about the voice, about the fabric. Some swore it was a ghost, the spirit of a sailor who'd never been rescued. Others believed it was a trick of the mind, the sea's way of preying on our fears. I don't know what I believe. All I know is that I heard that voice as clear as day. And every time I close my eyes, I hear it again. "Help me." It was a cry that didn't belong to this world, a desperate plea echoing through the void. And it followed us, lingering in the back of my mind long after we'd left those cursed waters behind. Story 4. Haunted Deck Plates. I was fresh out of A school, full of ambition and energy when I was assigned to my first ship, a weathered Navy vessel whose steel bones creaked and groaned with every shift of the sea. USS First Ship, they called it, like it was a rite of passage for rookies like me. My station was AW3, a dim, cramped auxiliary machinery space buried deep in the ship's belly. If you've ever been on a ship, you know what I'm talking about. The kind of space that reeks of oil and metal, lit by flickering fluorescent tubes that never quite banish the shadows. I always had a weird feeling about AW3. Maybe it was the stillness, even with the hum of machinery in the background. Or maybe it was the way sound traveled there, echoing off the steel bulkheads like whispers in the dark. But I told myself it was just nerves, just the adjustment to Navy life. It wasn't until I heard the footsteps for the first time that I started to question things. It was late, past midnight, and we were steaming toward our next port. The ship was alive with its usual symphony of machinery, the steady thrumming of engines, and the occasional groan as the hull flexed against the waves. I was on watch, alone in AW3, running through my rounds and double-checking gauges. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Not the usual clank and creak of machinery, but the distinct, deliberate sound of boots on steel deck plates. Fast, heavy. They seemed to come from above me at first, then down the ladder well, then, impossibly, back up again. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice echoing in the confined space. No response. The sound stopped for a moment, and I thought maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe it was just the ship shifting, or some odd acoustic trick. I turned back to my logbook, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had crept up my spine. Then it started again. This time the footsteps seemed closer, running back and forth across the deck plates above me. It didn't make sense. No one had any reason to be in that part of the ship, not at this hour. And the way they moved, it wasn't normal. Too fast, too frantic, like someone running in blind panic. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed the ladder to the next level, heart pounding in my chest. "All right, who's messing around up here?" I shouted, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Nothing. The space above AW3 was empty, just a dimly lit stretch of deck with no sign of life. I shone my light down the length of it, half expecting to see someone ducking around a corner, but there was no one there. No shadows moving, no sound except the distant thrum of the ship's engines. I stood there for a long moment, flashlight trembling in my hand. Then, just as I was about to turn back down the ladder, I heard it again. This time it was right behind me, the footsteps. Running. I whipped around, the beam of my flashlight darting across the empty space, but there was nothing there. My breath caught in my throat as the sound passed right by me, close enough that I could feel it, like a rush of air brushing against my skin. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, staring into the darkness. Eventually, I forced myself to climb back down to AW3, my mind racing with questions. Was it some kind of prank, a trick of the acoustics, or something else entirely? The next morning, I mentioned it to one of the older guys in the division, trying to keep it casual. Hey, have you ever heard anything weird in Auk 3? Like footsteps? He froze, his expression unreadable. Then he gave a short, nervous laugh. Yeah, he said after a moment. I've heard it, and so have a few others. Really? I pressed. He hesitated, then leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. They say it's a ghost, some kid who worked in Auk 3 years ago, before we got the ship. Supposedly he died down there, accident or maybe suicide, no one knows for sure. But ever since, well, people hear things. Footsteps mostly, sometimes voices, but it's just stories, man. Don't let it get in your head. I tried to take his advice, but the footsteps didn't stop. Over the next few weeks, I heard them again and again, always in the dead of night, always in Auk 3. Sometimes they seemed distant, like they were coming from another part of the ship. Other times, they were so close I could have sworn someone was standing right behind me. I wasn't the only one either. One of the other junior guys confided that he'd heard them too, and that he hated standing watch in Auk 3 because of it. But no one liked to talk about it openly. It was like an unspoken rule. Acknowledge it, and you were inviting it in. The last time I heard the footsteps was different. It was a quiet night, and the ship was in port, tied up at the pier. Most of the crew was ashore, and the spaces below decks felt even more deserted than usual. I was alone in Auk 3 again, halfway through my watch when the footsteps started. This time they were slow, deliberate. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand on end as the sound moved toward me, one step at a time. I turned, flashlight in hand, but there was nothing there. Stop messing with me, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The footsteps stopped. For a moment there was silence. Then out of nowhere, the overhead lights flickered and went out, plunging the space into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, panic rising in my chest. When I turned it on, the beam caught something, a shadow just for an instant, at the far end of the space. It wasn't a person. It couldn't have been. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form barely visible in the faint light. And then it was gone, vanishing into the darkness as the lights flickered back on. I don't remember much after that. I must have bolted out of Auk 3 because the next thing I knew, I was standing on the main deck gasping for air. I never went back to Auk 3 alone after that, and I never heard the footsteps again, though I know others did. To this day, I can't explain what I saw or what I felt, but I'll never forget it, and I'll never set foot on USS First Ship again. Story 5. I was stationed at Groton Sub-School back when it was still the MMA schoolhouse. I'll be honest, during my downtime as a rover, I had a bad habit of wandering where I wasn't supposed to. Nothing malicious, just a little curiosity to see how many places I could slip into that weren't locked. Most nights were uneventful. Quiet halls, silent rooms, the occasional shadow in the corner of my eye that I chalked up to poor lighting. But this night has never left me. It was about 3 a.m., that dead hour when the world seems heavier, quieter. I was doing my usual rove on the second floor. It wasn't much different from any other night. I moved silently through the halls, the dim emergency lights casting just enough of a glow for me to see a few feet ahead. The old building had its quirks, creaks, groans, the occasional drip from who knows where, but I was used to it. I was halfway down the corridor when I heard it, the faint scuff of a shoe on the stairs behind me. My stomach dropped. Shit, it's the duty chief. My heart kicked up a notch as I turned and glanced toward the staircase. I didn't see anyone, but I knew the sound. Someone was coming up. I quickly turned the other way, trying to act like I was doing something productive. Maybe inspecting the fire extinguishers, checking room locks, whatever excuse I could come up with if they caught me wandering. But as I moved, I realized something odd. The sound of the footsteps didn't stop. They didn't grow louder either. They stayed faint, like they were waiting. Then the creaking started. It came from the far end of the hallway near the stairwell. A low, steady groan, like weight pressing down on old wood. I froze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as the sound began to move, slowly, deliberately, down the hallway. I glanced behind me expecting to see someone, a silhouette, a shadow, anything, but the corridor was empty. Still, the sound kept coming. Closer. Closer. At this point, my mind was racing. Okay, the duty chief is messing with me. He's trying to catch me slacking off. I swallowed the lump in my throat and decided to outmaneuver him. I turned and headed up the staircase to the 3rd floor, where I knew it'd be pitch black. The overhead lights didn't work up there, and no one ever bothered to fix them. I figured I could slip away, circle back down, and get ahead of him. As I reached the top of the stairs, the air felt different, heavier, colder. It didn't make sense. I knew the HVAC system wasn't that bad. I pulled out my flashlight and swept it across the hallway. Nothing, just darkness and silence. Then I heard it again, the creaking, but this time it wasn't behind me. It was above me, the ceiling. I froze in place, my breath caught in my chest. The sound was steady, deliberate, like footsteps pacing directly above my head. But there wasn't a 4th floor, just the roof. What the hell is going on? My flashlight trembled in my hand as I shone it toward the ceiling, half expecting to see something crawling, staring back at me. But there was nothing. Only the sound, louder now, moving toward the stairs I'd just come up. I don't know why, but something in me snapped. Panic, maybe. I bolted back down the stairs, nearly tripping over my own feet. By the time I hit the 2nd floor again, I was sprinting. I didn't care if the duty chief saw me anymore. I just wanted to be out of there. I burst through the door to the POOD's office, my chest heaving, sweat dripping down my back. The petty officer of the deck looked up from his logbook, startled. "Who the hell is the duty chief tonight?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The POOD frowned. Chief Sullivan, I think." "Why? Where is he?" He shrugged. "Haven't seen him all night." "Why?" I stared at him, my mind racing. "Has anyone come in or out since the last watch change?" The POOD shook his head. "Numbered doors have been quiet." My legs felt weak. I dropped into the chair across from him, trying to piece it together. I wanted to tell him what I'd heard, what I'd felt, but how do you explain something like that without sounding crazy? "Look," he said, leaning forward. "You good? You look like you've seen a ghost." I forced a laugh, hollow and shaky. "Yeah, just tired. Long night." I didn't do another rove that night. Hell, I avoided the 2nd and 3rd floors for the rest of my time at Groton. But sometimes when I think back, I wonder, what would have happened if I'd stayed on that 2nd floor? If I'd followed the sound instead of running from it? I don't want to know. Story 6. The Haunted Watch I Served Aboard the USS Cole. A name that carries weight, not just for its tragic history, but for the stories whispered in the dark corners of the ship. I never put much stock in ghost stories, but after what happened, I can't explain what I saw or felt. It was my turn on the mid-watch. The ship was quiet, save for the hum of machinery. Midnight on the Cole has a way of pressing down on you, making the steel walls feel closer, the shadows darker. I was stationed in radio, a small, cramped room with just enough space for the equipment, a chair, and me. The routine was simple: monitor transmissions, log any activity, and stay awake. Boredom was the real enemy, or so I thought. That night, everything felt off. It was nothing I could put my finger on, just a weight in the air, like the ship itself was holding its breath. I shook it off, chalking it up to exhaustion. Around 200, as I was jotting down some notes, I heard it. A voice. It was faint at first, like a whisper caught in the static. I froze, my pen hovering over the logbook. "Is someone there?" I called out, my voice steady but low. Nothing, just the hum of the equipment. I went back to my work, but the feeling lingered. Then, clear as day, I heard it again. This time, it was my name. "Petty officer." It dragged, distorted, like someone was calling from far away. My stomach dropped. I spun around, expecting to see someone behind me. The room was empty. My eyes darted to the door. It was locked, just as I'd left it. "Very funny," I muttered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Who's messing with me?" Silence. I forced myself to focus, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But the voice had been so real. I could still hear the way it stretched my name, like it was testing it, tasting it. An hour passed, maybe two. I was starting to convince myself it was nothing when I felt it. A hand on my shoulder, firm, undeniable. I shot out of my chair so fast I nearly knocked it over. My heart was pounding. I turned to find nothing. There was no one there. The door was still locked. The radio equipment was silent. I was alone. My skin crawled, the lingering sensation of the touch burning into my shoulder. "Who's there?" My voice cracked, betraying the fear clawing at my throat. The room was stifling now, the air too heavy to breathe. I backed up until I was against the console, my eyes darting around the room, searching for something, anything to explain what was happening. Then the radio crackled to life. Static poured from the speakers, sharp and grating. I leaned in, squinting at the display. No signals were showing. The static grew louder, and underneath it, I could hear it again. My name. This time, it was clearer, more insistent. It wasn't just one voice now. It was many, overlapping, calling out to me in a dissonant, hollow chorus. "Petty officer, come here, come here." The words slithered into my ears, each one colder than the last. My blood turned to ice. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was like I was rooted to the spot, held there by something unseen. Suddenly, the lights flickered. Once, twice. Then darkness swallowed the room. The static stopped abruptly, leaving behind a deafening silence. My breath came in short, shallow gasps, the only sound breaking the void. And then I saw it. It was just a shadow at first, darker than the pitch black of the room. It moved, shifting in the corner, stretching across the walls. It didn't have a shape, more like a smudge on reality itself, an absence of light. But I felt it looking at me. I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping the edge of the console until my knuckles ached. "This isn't real," I whispered. "It's not real." When I opened my eyes, the shadow was gone. The lights flickered back on. Everything was exactly as it had been before. Quiet, still, ordinary. But I wasn't the same. I didn't finish my watch that night. I left the room, my steps echoing too loud in the empty corridor, and headed straight to the mess. I needed light, noise, people, anything to shake the feeling of that thing watching me. When my relief showed up, I didn't say a word about what happened. Not then. It wasn't until weeks later, when I overheard a couple of shipmates trading stories, that I realized I wasn't alone. "You ever hear someone call your name when no one's there?" one of them asked, his voice low. The other nodded. "Yeah, and sometimes you feel them too, like they're right there with you." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. They exchanged a glance, and the first guy leaned in. "The Cole's got history," he said. "Some people think it's more than just the crew we lost that lingers here. You know what I mean?" I didn't. Not really, but I didn't need to. Whatever I experienced that night wasn't just in my head. I don't know what it was, but I know it wasn't nothing. I've told myself 100 times since then that there's a logical explanation for what happened. Stress, sleep deprivation, maybe a glitch in the equipment, but deep down, I know the truth. The USS Cole is haunted, and whatever's out there, whatever's still lingering in the steel and shadows of that ship, it doesn't want to be ignored. Story 7, A Night in Pearl Harbor. I'll never forget the night I felt the past reach out, cold and unrelenting, from beyond the veil of the present. It was a few years ago, back when I was stationed in Pearl Harbor. I was serving as the command duty officer, and the nights were long but uneventful, for the most part. That night, though, was anything but ordinary. The base at night had its own kind of stillness, the kind that made you hyper-aware of every creak, every whisper of the wind, every footstep echoing in the distance. By the time I finished my rounds, it was close to 20:30. I still had to grab a few folders from my office before heading home. The building was old, a relic from a time when Pearl Harbor was the epicenter of one of history's most defining moments. The office floor was expansive and dimly lit. Only a single bulb glowed faintly at the far end, casting long shadows across the room. I didn't need the light to find my way, though. I knew the layout by heart: the rows of desks, the scattered chairs, the faint smell of aged wood and paper. It was all familiar. I stepped inside, my boots clacking softly against the polished floor, the sound swallowed by the oppressive quiet. I was halfway across the room when I heard it. Click, clack, click, clack. The unmistakable sound of an old typewriter echoed faintly in the darkness. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I scanned the room, my eyes straining to adjust to the darkness. There was no one there, just shadows and silence. For a moment I thought I'd imagined it, that maybe the fatigue of the day was playing tricks on me. But then it came again. Click, clack, click, clack. And this time, it was accompanied by something else. A voice, low and murmuring, just on the edge of hearing, like someone was speaking to themselves while they worked. The words were indistinct, more like a raspy muttering than a coherent conversation. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. My pulse quickened. There was no logical explanation. The office was empty. I'd locked the doors earlier that evening myself. No one should have been here. No one could have been here. And yet, the sounds continued. I debated leaving. My instincts screamed at me to turn around, to get out of there and forget the damn folders. But curiosity, or maybe pride, held me in place. I wasn't about to let some phantom noise spook me. I took a deep breath and forced my feet to move, each step heavier than the last. As I moved closer to my desk, the sound grew louder, more distinct. The typewriter clicks were steady, rhythmic, and the murmuring voice grew clearer, though I still couldn't make out the words. It sounded female. "Hello," I called out, my voice cutting through the stillness. The sound stopped. Silence. The kind of silence that isn't empty but charged, as though the air itself was holding its breath. I stood there, rooted to the spot, listening, waiting. My eyes darted around the room, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Then I saw it. At the far end of the room, just beyond the reach of the dim light, something moved. It was faint, almost imperceptible, like the shimmer of heat rising off asphalt. A figure, no, a presence, seemed to linger there, hovering at the edge of the darkness. I felt an icy chill seep into my bones, a primal fear I couldn't rationalize. My mouth went dry. My legs felt like lead. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. I didn't wait to see if it would return. I turned on my heel and walked out, my pace brisk but measured, as though running might provoke whatever it was. The moment I stepped into the hallway, the oppressive weight lifted, and I could breathe again. I didn't sleep much that night. The sound of that typewriter, the murmuring voice, the shadowy presence, it all played over and over in my mind. I kept telling myself there had to be a logical explanation, that maybe it was an old pipe rattling, or the wind somehow carrying sounds into the building. But deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I mentioned it casually, too casually, to one of the older civilian workers in the department. She was one of the aunties, as we called them, always ready with a warm smile and a kind word. I thought she'd laugh, maybe tease me about letting my imagination run wild. Instead, her face grew serious. "You heard her," she said simply. I blinked. "Heard who?" "The secretary," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "She worked on that floor during the attack on Pearl Harbor. When the bombs hit, she stayed at her desk, typing up reports, trying to send out messages. They say she was trying to warn others to save lives, but she didn't make it. The building took a direct hit. She died there at her desk." A cold shiver ran down my spine. "She's been there ever since," the auntie continued. "People hear her sometimes, the typewriter, her voice. She doesn't mean any harm, but she doesn't leave either." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as an old ghost story, a bit of local lore meant to spook newcomers. But the look in her eyes told me she believed every word. And deep down, so did I. I never heard the typewriter again, but every time I stepped into that office at night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That somewhere just beyond the edge of sight and sound, she was still there, carrying out her duty long after her time had ended. Story 8, The Watch Below Deck. I've always prided myself on my ability to stay calm under pressure. As a petty officer aboard the USS Theodore Roosevelt, CVN-71, it was a necessity. But there are things no amount of training or resolve can prepare you for. I learned that the hard way one night in Guam. We had just pulled in, but with COVID protocols in place, more than half the crew was ashore. The ship felt hollow, eerie. Spaces that once buzzed with life now echoed with every footstep, every faint creak of steel. I was on watch, assigned to rove below decks, checking for fire, flooding, or unauthorized personnel. It was the graveyard shift, and at around 0230, the ship felt dead, save for me and the steel beneath my boots. I just finished my sweep of Cargo 7, one of the lowest spaces on the ship. 7 decks down. It was always unsettling down there, the kind of place where your flashlight barely penetrates the darkness, and the silence presses in on you like a weight. I hated it, but orders were orders. I started my climb back up the trunk ladder well, a vertical shaft lined with rungs that seemed to stretch endlessly upward. My boots clanged against the metal with each step, a steady rhythm that kept my nerves in check. About halfway up, I paused to catch my breath. That's when I heard it. Clang. The sound of a boot hitting the rung below me. I froze, my pulse quickening. I glanced down, shining my flashlight into the trunk. Nothing. Just shadows. Maybe I'd misheard. Maybe it was an echo of my own movements. I shook it off and kept climbing. Clang. Clang. 2 more steps. Deliberate. Closer this time. I looked down again, leaning further into the shaft. "Who's there?" I called, my voice bouncing off the steel walls. No response, just the faint hum of the ship's systems. I gritted my teeth and kept going. Faster this time, my gloved hands gripping the rungs tight. My heart was pounding now, but I forced myself to focus. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe someone was playing a prank. Maybe. Clang. 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 The sound was right behind me now. I didn't dare look down again. I just climbed, my breaths coming short and quick. Whoever or whatever was there, it was keeping pace with me, and it wasn't stopping. I reached the top of the trunk and hauled myself out, nearly slipping on the deck as I stumbled away from the opening. My flashlight beam darted wildly, scanning the corridor for any sign of another sailor. Nothing. The trunk was empty. I stood there shaking, trying to catch my breath. "This is ridiculous," I muttered to myself. I wasn't going to let some shadow scare me off. Determined, I checked the adjacent trunk, thinking maybe someone had been climbing in parallel, and I just imagined the noise coming from behind me. But it was empty too. The whole corridor was empty. My skin crawled. I reported in over the radio, trying to keep my voice steady. "All clear in the lower decks," I said, leaving out the details. What was I supposed to say? That I was being chased by an invisible sailor? I continued my rove, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every creak, every whisper of air through the ventilation system set my nerves on edge. My flashlight felt useless against the oppressive darkness, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more times than I could count. When I finally made it back to the watch station, my relief noticed something was off. "You good, man?" he asked, eyeing me with concern. "Yeah," I lied, wiping the sweat from my brow. "Just a long night." But it wasn't just the night, it was the longest rove I'd ever done. And not because of the hours. Something had followed me in that trunk, something I couldn't see or explain. And I wonder, what would have happened if I hadn't made it out in time? Story 9. I was stationed on a Navy ship at the time, a massive labyrinth of steel and machinery, always buzzing faintly like it was alive. The endless passageways, P-ways as we call them, had a way of playing tricks on your senses late at night, especially under the dim red lights used during nighttime operations. It was just another late watch for me, or so I thought. That night, I was heading back from the mess deck after grabbing a quick bite. It was late, way past the time most people were up unless they were on watch. The ship was eerily quiet, save for the hum of machinery and the occasional distant clang of metal. As I walked down the P-way, the silence felt unusually heavy, almost oppressive, like the air itself was denser. But I shook it off. Long nights and exhaustion can make you feel all kinds of weird. About halfway down the P-way, I heard it. Footsteps. At first they were faint, like someone trying not to be noticed. They matched my pace perfectly, a soft tap, tap, tap just behind me. I stopped dead in my tracks and turned around, expecting to see someone. Maybe another sailor heading to berthing or the head. But the passageway was empty. Not a soul. I shrugged it off, telling myself I must have imagined it. Exhaustion can do that, and especially after a long shift. I started walking again, but after a few steps I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. This time it was louder, more deliberate, and definitely closer. I glanced back quickly, but still, no one was there. My heartbeat quickened as I picked up my pace, heading straight past berthing. The footsteps grew louder, heavier, like whoever, or whatever it was, wanted me to know it was there. When I reached the knee knocker, a low metal threshold we have to step over, I heard it clear as day. The unmistakable clang of a steel-toed boot hitting the knee knocker behind me. That was impossible. I had just passed it, and no one had been there. I spun around, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. The P-way was empty, completely empty. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling despite my effort to sound in control. The only response was the hum of the ship. I stood frozen for what felt like minutes, straining my ears for any sound. Then I heard it again. Footsteps. But this time, they weren't behind me. They were in front of me. 2 heavy steps, clear and deliberate. I snapped my head forward, my breath catching in my throat. There was nothing. Absolutely nothing. But the footsteps had stopped, as if whoever, or whatever it was standing right in front of me. I backed up slowly, my boots scraping against the deck. My mind raced for an explanation. Maybe it was someone playing a prank. Maybe the ship's acoustics were bouncing the sound around. But deep down, I knew neither of those made sense. The footsteps had been too real, too deliberate. I forced myself to move, walking quickly down the P-way toward the watch station. My nerves were shot, and every shadow seemed to shift and move out of the corner of my eye. When I finally made it to the station, one of the girls on watch, Emily, looked up from her logbook. "You okay?" "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, half joking. I hesitated, debating whether to tell her. Finally, I blurted out, "I think someone or something was following me down the P-way just now." Her smile faded, replaced by a serious expression. "Was it the cross P-way near berthing?" I nodded slowly, a chill running down my spine. "Yeah, why?" She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "A couple of nights ago, I was walking down that same P-way. When I glanced down the cross P-way, I saw something. It looked like a person, but it wasn't. It was more like a shadow, but darker, if that makes sense. And it wasn't moving. It was just standing there watching me. I didn't stick around to figure out what it was." Her words made my blood run cold. I wasn't imagining things. Whatever I had experienced, it wasn't just in my head. It wasn't the first time strange things had happened aboard the ship either. On shore duty, I had another encounter that I still can't explain. A buddy and I were working late in the admin building. It was just the 2 of us, and we were wrapping up some paperwork when we both saw it. A rolly chair suddenly shot across the floor, as if someone had shoved it. We stared at each other, wide-eyed, neither of us saying a word. Then the motion alarm went off on the loading dock. We had the security camera feed pulled up, and we both turned to watch it. The dock was empty. Not a single thing was moving, but the alarm kept blaring. My buddy muttered something about the wind or a malfunction, but his voice wavered. He didn't believe it any more than I did. I don't know what it is about places like ships or old buildings. Maybe it's the history, the countless lives that have passed through. Or maybe it's something else entirely, something we're not meant to understand. All I know is, after that night on the ship, I always made sure to have someone with me when I walked down the P-way late at night, because whatever was out there, it wasn't just in my head, and it wasn't friendly. Story 10. I used to be stationed at Naval Hospital Beaufort in South Carolina, working the graveyard shift as a roving security officer. The hospital was an older building, silent except for the occasional hum of fluorescent lights and the muted beeping of machines. Night shifts were always eerie. Something about empty hallways and the darkness pressing against the windows makes you hyper-aware of every sound. But what happened that night, that was something I'll never forget. It was around 2:30 a.m. I was doing my usual rounds, walking through the basement level, where the loading dock and service elevators are located. The air down there was always heavier, colder than anywhere else in the hospital. It wasn't unusual for me to feel on edge, but this time, it felt different. There was an unnatural stillness, like the place was holding its breath. I was halfway down the hallway when I heard it, a soft ding. My heart skipped. I turned toward the sound, and sure enough, the elevator at the far end of the hall had opened its doors. No one was there. I stared at it for a second, listening, waiting. The doors stayed open far longer than they should have, almost as if something or someone was holding them. I radioed it in. "Control, this is Baker. Elevator A in the basement just opened on its own. Can you check the system?" The static crackled, and a voice replied, "Copy, Baker." "That's odd. There's no one scheduled to use it down there right now." "Stand by." I approached the elevator cautiously, my flashlight cutting through the dim corridor. The beam landed inside, but it was empty. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up as if I wasn't alone. I hit the button to close the doors, and they slid shut without issue. I stood there for a moment, staring at the floor numbers above. Nothing happened. Satisfied that it was probably a glitch, I turned to continue my round. Then came the sound of the loading dock door creaking open behind me. I spun around so fast I nearly dropped my flashlight. The heavy steel door, the one I had personally locked an hour earlier, was wide open, swinging slightly as if someone had just passed through. My pulse was thundering in my ears now. This wasn't a glitch. Someone or something was here. I stepped forward, shining my flashlight into the loading dock. The beam caught the edge of the door as it slowly came to a stop. Beyond it, the space was empty. Rows of parked hospital vans, stacks of supply crates, but no movement. The silence was deafening. "Control," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The loading dock door just opened by itself. "Confirming no personnel in the area?" There was a long pause before the reply. "Negative, Baker. No one's authorized to be down there except you." My mouth went dry. I approached the door, checking the lock mechanism. It was intact, no sign of tampering. That's when I heard it, a faint shuffling sound, like footsteps coming from the far side of the dock. My flashlight swept across the space, landing on nothing but shadows. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice echoing. No answer. I moved closer, my boots scraping against the concrete floor. The shuffling sound stopped. Just as I was about to write it off as my imagination, something fell, a loud clang, like a metal tray being dropped. It came from the storage room adjacent to the dock. I froze. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. That room was locked. It had to be. I knew it was. Against every instinct screaming at me to turn back, I moved toward the storage room. The door was ajar, a sliver of darkness spilling into the dock. I pushed it open with the end of my flashlight and stepped inside. Rows of shelves stretched out before me, casting long, jagged shadows in the beam of my light. "Is anyone here?" I asked, my voice trembling. The only response was the distant hum of the hospital's ventilation system. I swept my flashlight over the shelves, one by one, until the beam landed on something that made my blood run cold. One of the supply carts had been pulled out into the aisle. On it were surgical instruments, scalpels, clamps, scissors, all neatly laid out as if someone had been preparing for an operation. But that wasn't the worst part. Each instrument was pointed in the same direction, all aligned perfectly, their sharp ends facing me. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. My mind was racing, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. There was no way this was a prank. No one else was down here. And even if they were, they couldn't have moved that silently. I backed out of the room, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip my radio. "Control, I'm requesting immediate backup to the basement. Something's not right down here." The reply was almost instant. "Backup is en route. Stay put." But I couldn't stay. I needed to get out of there. I turned and headed for the elevator, walking fast, my flashlight bouncing wildly against the walls. When I reached the elevator, the doors opened before I could press the button. The car was empty, but the floor panel was lit up, as if someone had just selected a floor. Control, I whispered into my radio. The elevator is... Before I could finish, the doors started to close. I lunged forward, jamming my hand between them. They slid open again, and I stepped inside, my breathing ragged. I hit the button for the main floor, desperate to get back to the safety of the control room. As the elevator began to rise, I felt it, a shift in the air. The temperature plummeted, and my breath fogged in the beam of my flashlight. Then, just as the elevator reached the main floor, the lights inside flickered and went out. I was plunged into darkness. The doors opened, and I stumbled out, gasping for air. The hallway was empty, brightly lit, as if nothing had happened. I turned back to look at the elevator, but the doors were already closing, sealing whatever had been with me inside. When backup arrived, we searched the entire basement. We found nothing. The loading dock door was locked tight, the storage room undisturbed, and the elevators functioning normally. I tried to explain what I'd experienced, but no one believed me. They chalked it up to exhaustion or an overactive imagination. But I know what I saw, what I felt. Something was down there and it wasn't human. I transferred out of Beaufort 2 months later. I never went back. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.